In the forensics of Black American identity, the 1,970 seconds was a laboratory of self-definition. To understand the gravity of Soul Train, you have to look past the television screen and into the living rooms of Saturday morning America. The atmosphere in these rooms always changed when the first synthesized notes of the theme song rolled across the airwaves. The light felt warmer. The air grew heavier with a specific kind of rhythm. For many Black families, this was not merely a television show. It was a forensic report on their own dignity, a window into who they were allowed to be when the white-dominated media wasn't looking. But the investigation into this cultural milestone reveals a lingering dissonance behind the color and the joy. We are auditing a state of cultural friction. What happens when the very place built to celebrate Black greatness becomes the stage for its deepest generational and psychological conflicts? Why would the woman whose voice defined the spiritual core of a people, Aretha Franklin, find herself at odds with the man who built the most important Black stage in history? Before anyone said her name, you could feel it. Aretha Franklin stepping into the Soul Train studio was not just a performance, it was a shift in the atmospheric pressure. She walked in with the weight of a legacy forged in the gospel fire of Detroit and the civil rights struggles of the 1,960 seconds. But she was also entering a music world that was already beginning to liquefy beneath her feet. The investigation reveals a woman standing at the crossroads of her own power, facing a host, Don Cornelius, who was the ultimate surveyor of Black cool. Some witnesses said she was welcomed with the reverence due to a queen. Others whispered that she was met with the cold, professional distance of a man who feared losing control of his domain. Between these two versions of the truth lies a forensic study of power, pride, and the struggle for ownership inside Black culture. This investigation is not about the dance steps, it is about the psychological territory. Who decided who belonged on a stage that claimed to belong to everyone? The forensics of the 1,970 seconds show that Soul Train was a miracle of representation. Don Cornelius had built an empire from a single camera and a dream that Black culture should not be edited, trimmed, or explained to a white audience. He wanted a stage where the culture could breathe. But the investigation asks, what happens to the architect when the building starts to change shape? Cornelius had designed a cathedral of elegance, but a new generation was arriving with a language of rebellion. As Aretha prepared to sing live in a studio designed for lip-syncing, she was performing an act of musical sovereignty. She was refusing to be polished. She was bringing the raw, unfiltered burn of the Detroit church into the neon world of Los Angeles. This was the first sign of the fragmentation to come, the collision between the traditional soul of the elders and the defiant edge of the youth. We are stepping into the noise, the fashion, and the silence. This is the forensic audit of a dream that became a mirror that eventually revealed the cracks in the very foundation it was meant to hold steady. As the Soul Train line forms, we realize that the most important moves weren't the ones made on the dance floor, but the ones made in the hearts of those fighting to define what soul really meant. Stay with me, because the train is leaving the station, and the track is far more dangerous than it looks. In the forensics of Black media, the origin of a revolution is rarely found in a corporate boardroom. It is found in the frustration of a man who refuses to accept the edited version of himself. To understand the momentum of Soul Train, the investigation must look at Chicago in the late 1,960 seconds. Don Cornelius was not born an icon of the airwaves. The data shows he was a man of the streets, and the law a former police officer and a local radio reporter who possessed a high-definition view of the gap between Black brilliance and its reflection in American media. Cornelius watched Black artists pour their sweat and genius into a world that only looked back at them through a filter of white approval. Representation was a thin, distorted wire. Respect was non-existent. The forensics of his early career show a man who recognized a cultural wound, the systematic erasure of Black joy from the national screen. He didn't want to just be on TV, he wanted to own the frame. He started Soul Train in 1970 with a single camera, a small set, and a dream that functioned like a biological necessity. He wanted a stage where Black culture was the primary frequency, not a secondary background. While Cornelius was building his stage, The investigation reveals a parallel atmospheric shift in Detroit. Aretha Franklin was not a created product of the music industry. She was a natural phenomenon shaped by the gospel cathedral. The forensics of her childhood in the New Bethel Baptist Church are critical. Her father, Reverend C. Lurs Franklin, was the man with the million-dollar voice, a leader who turned his pulpit into a hub for activists like Martin Luther King Jr. and musicians like Dinah Washington. Young Aretha grew up in a world where the voice was a weapon for justice and a vessel for the divine. The data on her early career shows a state of artistic misalignment. Signed to Columbia Records as a teenager, the industry tried to dress her voice in the polished jazz and pop tropes of the time. They gave her melodies that floated but did not burn. The investigation reveals that Aretha's true north wasn't found in the pop charts. It was found in the burn, the visceral intersection of pain and power. It wasn't until she walked into Atlantic Records in 1967 and recorded I Never Loved a Man in the humidity of Muscle Shoals that the world finally heard the unfiltered frequency of the woman who would become the, quote, Queen of Soul. By the time their paths crossed in the 1,970 seconds, both Dawn and Aretha were survivors of a forensic battle. They had both fought for respect in systems that rarely offered it. When Soul Train moved from the local circuit of Chicago to the national stage of Los Angeles, it became a gravitational force for icons like Aretha. The investigation shows that their meeting on the show was never just a booking. It was a collision of two different visions of black sovereignty. Don Cornelius believed in the elegance of order. He wanted Soul Train to be a cathedral of black beauty, well-dressed, coordinated, and sophisticated. He was the architect of the cool, and he guarded that cool with a fierce, almost territorial instinct. Aretha Franklin, however, believed in the honesty of the moment. Her soul wasn't about the coordination of the dance line. It was about the crack in the falsetto and the weight of the gospel roots. The forensics of their interaction reveal a subtle, atmospheric friction. Cornelius wanted the polished star who would fit into his smooth visual machine. Aretha was the star who arrived with the weight of her own history, refusing to be just another act. She brought the church into the club. He brought the club into the living room. As the train accelerated toward national dominance, these two titans were navigating a shared space, but they were breathing different air. They were both building a bridge for the next generation, but the investigation suggests that they were already beginning to disagree on what that bridge should look like and who, ultimately, should be allowed to walk across it. In the forensics of 1,970 seconds, television production, the studio was a place of controlled artifice. For a show like Soul Train, the objective was visual perfection. The dancers were the scenery, the lighting was a neon embrace, and the music was almost always delivered via lip-syncing. This was a technical necessity. Capturing high-fidelity live sound in a room full of hundreds of stomping teenagers was a forensic nightmare. But when Aretha Franklin arrived during the Sparkle era in the mid-70 seconds, she brought a demand that threatened to break the Soul Train system. She refused to use a pre-recorded track. She demanded the live frequency. The investigation into this specific performance reveals a state of technological tension. Don Cornelius had built a machine designed for smooth visuals and clean lines. To allow Aretha to sing live meant bringing in a full band, setting up complex microphone arrays, and risking a messy audio mix. For Cornelius, this was a loss of control. But for Aretha, singing live was an act of musical sovereignty. She did not belong to the polished, edited side of soul. She belonged to the part that cracked open the heart in real time. She needed the burn. When the cameras rolled, the atmospheric pressure in the room shifted. Aretha stood at the piano, her presence commanding a different kind of silence from the Soul Train dancers. The forensics of the performance, specifically of the song Something He Can Feel, show a profound acoustic disorientation. As her voice cut through the studio air without the safety net of a studio-compressed track, the dancers didn't just move to a beat, they paused. The investigation reveals that the air literally thickened. Her voice, shaped by the rafters of the New Bethel Baptist Church, wasn't just entertainment, it was a confession. The data on the Soul Train line during this performance reveals a rare moment of spiritual synchronization. Usually, the line was a place for individual flair and flamboyant fashion. But under the weight of Aretha's live vocal, the motion changed. It became slower, more intentional, more grounded in the gravity of true soul music. Aretha was performing a system reset on the show. She was reminding the youth, the dancers, and Cornelius himself that while the clothes and the hair were the window, the voice was the house. However, the forensics of the director's booth show a different story. Don Cornelius watched from the sidelines with a guarded expression. To the world, this was a legendary television moment. To Cornelius, it was a breach of his aesthetic protocol. The investigation suggests that this was the beginning of the subtle fracture. Cornelius was the architect of a world where he was the final arbiter of cool. Aretha Franklin, through the sheer force of her biological gift, had temporarily seized the throne. She had proven that the queen didn't need the train needed the queen. The forensics of the Sparkle era also highlight a shift in the Black American landscape. The collaboration between Aretha and Curtis Mayfield was a data point of cultural evolution. It blended the softness of the church with the strength of the urban street. By bringing this sound to Soul Train, Aretha was attempting to bridge the gap between the civil rights generation and the rising funk era. But as she led the room through the live frequency, the investigation reveals that the other 75%, the business, the ego, and the territorial nature of black media, was starting to create a cold current beneath the floorboards. Aretha's performance set a tone for the future, but it also highlighted the fragility of the Soul Train dream. It proved that you could have the most important stage in the world, but if the soul was too raw, it could still vibrate the building apart. Cornelius wanted a sanctuary. Aretha brought a storm. As the applause died down and the neon lights flickered, the investigation concludes that the queen had left her mark on the floor, but the architect was already wondering if the building could handle the next storm, a storm that was already gathering in the streets of New York, carrying a sound that wouldn't just challenge the frequency, but would attempt to burn the whole station down. In the forensics of a cultural institution, the most dangerous moment is not the decline in ratings, but the loss of the frequency. By the early 1980 seconds, Soul Train was no longer just a television show. It was a museum of a specific kind of black excellence. Don Cornelius had spent a decade curating a cathedral of polished soul, an aesthetic of silk, sequins, and coordinated motion. But the investigation into the mid-80 seconds reveals a profound, systemic shock. A new sound was rising from the concrete of the Bronx, carrying a frequency that didn't just vibrate the walls, it threatened to tear the foundation out. Hip-hop was a forensic anomaly for Don Cornelius. It was loud, it was messy, and it was unapologetically raw. To Cornelius, who viewed himself as the surveyor of the sophisticated, this new movement felt like a regression. The investigation into his internal memos and interviews from this era reveals a state of aesthetic resistance. He believed Soul Train was a sanctuary for beauty and grace. Hip-hop, with its aggressive delivery and street posturing, felt like a breach of his aesthetic protocol. The forensics of the studio floor show a quiet battlefield between tradition and youth. The dancers, always the primary data points for the culture's pulse, were the first to pivot. They weren't just gliding anymore. They were breaking, locking, and moving with a body-forward style that unsettled Cornelius. The investigation into the experiences of dancers like Rosie Perez reveals a state of managerial friction. Perez would later recount how Cornelius watched from off-stage with a tight, disapproving expression as the East Coast edge began to dominate his floor. He didn't see a new art form. He saw a loss of the cool he had spent 20 years refining. But the forensics of the 1980 seconds and 90 seconds reveal that the shadow wasn't just on the stage, it was in the boardrooms and the private rooms of the architect himself. This is the audit of institutional betrayal. In the late 80 seconds, Joe Cobb, the legendary voice behind the Soul Train, opening Scream, filed a lawsuit that sent forensic ripples through the legacy. Cobb claimed he had been systematically underpaid and eventually erased from the very sound he helped define. It was a recurring data point in the 75% business. The men who built the textures of the dream were often the first to be discarded once the machine became self-sustaining. As the business disputes mounted, the investigation delves into the dark, atmospheric currents surrounding Cornelius's personal life. For years, whispers had circulated about his involvement in the Playboy scene. The forensics of a later documentary would paint an unsettling picture of a man who possessed a dual nature, one side the public avatar of black dignity, the other, a man involved in allegations of harm that were too visceral to ignore. Though no charges were filed at the time, the data reveals a cultural cloud that began to gather over the Soul Train empire. The terminal strike to the image of the architect occurred in 2008. The forensics of his arrest for domestic violence involving his wife, Victoria Chapman, were sharp and public. The investigation into the court records shows a man who pleaded no contest to charges of corporal injury on a spouse. The data point was undeniable. The tall, steady host who once guided millions through a world of joy was now being reflected in the harsh, clinical light of a courtroom. The investigation concludes that by the early 2000s, Soul Train was suffering from multifaceted fragmentation. The generational gap had turned into a canyon. Cornelius could no longer speak the language of the youth, and the youth no longer saw his cathedral as their home. The rise of BET and MTV's The Grind created a competitive environment that rendered the train a relic of a previous century. The 75% business had finally caught up with the 25% joy. Cornelius had built a bridge for an entire people, but the investigation suggests that he remained standing in the middle of that bridge while the world moved across it and left him behind. He had successfully performed the miracle of representation, but he had failed to perform the miracle of adaptation. As the lights dimmed on his hosting era, the forensics show a man surrounded by the ghosts of his own creation, haunted by the sound of a new generation he couldn't control, and the legal echoes of a private life he couldn't hide. The Soul Train was still on the tracks, but the architect was no longer in the engine room. He was a passenger in a world he no longer recognized. In the forensics of cultural diplomacy, Soul Train stands as one of the most significant soft power exports in American history. To understand its weight, we must look beyond the domestic ratings and into the global data transmission of the black image. Long before the term cultural ambassador was a corporate buzzword, the train was a high-definition signal being beamed into nations that had previously only seen black Americans through the distorted lens of poverty, servitude, or civil rights trauma. The investigation into the show's international syndication reveals a state of transnational resonance. Countries from Japan to Nigeria were suddenly witnessing black life not as a struggle for survival, but as a state of supreme, unalloyed joy. The forensics of the international audience reveal that Soul Train functioned as a visual manifesto of aspiration. In regions of the world where black identity was often suppressed or ignored, the Soul Train line became a universal symbol of human freedom. The data shows that the fashion, the bell-bottoms, the towering afros, the platform shoes, and the rhythmic synchronization were being meticulously audited and copied across continents. In the 1,970 seconds and 80 seconds, the train was the primary source code for what the world defined as cool. This wasn't just entertainment. It was a structural shift in how the planet perceived the black body in motion. However, as the fractures began to appear in the Don Cornelius doctrine, the world watched with a unique kind of fascination. They weren't just watching a show undergo a transition. They were watching the evolution of a culture's struggle with its own internal boundaries. Domestically, the investigation reveals a state of generational friction that mirrored the debates happening in black living rooms across every time zone in America. The divide between Don Cornelius and the rising hip-hop movement was a forensic reflection of the respectability versus rebellion conflict that has haunted black progress for a century. Older generations, who had fought through the visceral brutality of the Jim Crow era and the fire hoses of the 1,960 seconds, clung to the polished, respectable soul of Aretha Franklin, the OJs, and the Temptations. They saw Cornelius's Cathedral of Elegance as a hard-won victory, a fortress of black dignity that proved they could be as sophisticated and coordinated as any white-led production. To them, the arrival of hip-hop with its baggy clothes, aggressive posturing, and raw, street-level linguistics felt like a breach of the fortress. They viewed the edge as a threat to the elegance they had spent a lifetime building. The younger generation, however, saw the polished soul as a beautiful but static relic. The forensics of the 1,980 seconds and 90 seconds show that the truth had moved from the velvet stage of the 1,970 seconds to the concrete blocks of the Reagan-era cities. For the youth, dignity wasn't found in a coordinated dance step. It was found in the raw honesty of the struggle. They didn't want to glide, they wanted to break. This domestic divide didn't just belong to the Soul Train studio, it belonged to the American soul. Soul Train became the forensic record of a people learning how to navigate the shift from the gospel dream to the street reality. When the show struggled to adapt, it served as a warning about how fragile representation can be when it becomes frozen in an aesthetic of the past. The investigation concludes that the world's reaction to the cracks within Soul Train told a single profound story. The miracle was mortal. Scholars and cultural critics began to audit the show as a living archive, a record of movement, sound, and identity. They argued that the conflicts within the studio mirrored the tensions inside the American heart. When Don Cornelius eventually stepped down as host, the global audience understood it as the closing of a specific kind of American chapter. The data reveals that even as the show's relevance faded in the face of newer, louder platforms like BET and MTV, the global mirror remained. The investigation into the Soul Train legacy internationally shows that while the show was ending, the seeds it had planted were blooming in J-pop, Afrobeats, and European dance culture. The world had seen black joy in its highest definition, and once that signal had been sent, it could never be fully recalled. Don Cornelius had successfully turned a local Chicago dance program into a global standard of human expression, proving that even when the bridge begins to crack under the weight of generational change, the traffic it carried has already permanently altered the landscape on the other side. In the final forensics of a cultural empire, the end is rarely a clean break. It is a slow fade, a gradual receding of the light until only the echoes and the architecture remain. For Soul Train, the lights didn't just go out. They dimmed over decades of generational shifts, legal battles, and the personal fragmentation of its creator. The investigation into the final years of Don Cornelius reveals a state of institutional and biological isolation. The man who had once been the primary surveyor of the cool found himself in a world that had moved beyond his elegance of order. The forensics of the 1st of February 2012 represent the ultimate system shutdown. The investigation into the death of Don Cornelius at his home in Los Angeles reveals a tragic, self-inflicted conclusion. At 75 years old, facing the dual pressures of declining health, specifically the fallout from a previous brain surgery and the onset of dementia, and the public unraveling of his private reputation, the architect chose to exit his own creation. The data shows that Cornelius had become a prisoner of his own high standards. Unable to maintain the steady frequency that had defined his public life, he performed a final, desperate skippity-doo-dah from a reality he no longer wished to inhabit. But the investigation concludes that the death of the architect did not mean the death of the building. In the forensics of legacy, there is a phenomenon known as permanent resonance. The impact of what Don Cornelius built in Chicago and Los Angeles does not disappear with the man. It stays in the muscle memory of a people. You see it in every modern award show that borrows the flair of the Soul Train line. You see it in every music video that echoes the style and kinetic motion of the 1,970-second studio floor. Cornelius had successfully built a sovereign space where black joy was its own justification, and that space remains a blueprint for every black media empire that followed. Parallel to this, the forensics of Aretha Franklin's final chapter reveal a different kind of sovereignty. Unlike Cornelius, who struggled with the other 75% of the business and the image, Aretha's legacy remained anchored in the 25% of the voice. The investigation into her final years shows a woman who never lost the live frequency. Even as the music world fragmented into digital subgenres, Aretha remained the North Star of the spiritual soul. Her voice did more than fill rooms. It provided a language for pain, pride, and hope that transcended the decades. The investigation reveals that her appearance on Soul Train in the 1,970 seconds was a forensic marker of a united history. She didn't need the show to confirm her greatness, but the show needed her to confirm its soul. When she stood at that piano and sang Something He Can Feel, she tied the gospel past to the funk future, proving that dignity does not need a polished script, it only needs a rhythm that refuses to break. The forensics of her death in 2018 were met with a global state funeral, a data point that confirms she was, and will always be, the unfragmented soul of the culture. As we close this audit, we realize that some stories end without closure, but dignity does not need applause. The truth of both Don Cornelius and Aretha Franklin is complicated. It is a tapestry of triumph and error, celebration and regret. The investigation into Soul Train shows that it was never just a television program. It was a forensic record of Black America learning how to see itself not as a shadow on the margins, but as the force shaping the center. The train was a bridge, and even with the shadows that followed the architect, the traffic it carried has permanently altered the landscape of the world. To anyone who has ever stood alone in their own story, wondering if their voice or their vision matters, look at the residual frequency these lives left behind. They left a path. They left a blueprint. They left a rhythm that still holds steady in the hearts of those who remember. The forensics of the Soul Train conclude that, while the train has left the station, the track remains open. The cool has been democratized, the burn has been documented, and the soul remains unfragmented. If this story reminds you of someone you grew up watching, an elder who held on to the elegance, or a youth who fought for the edge, know that their struggle was part of this larger architecture. These memories are the data recovery that keeps the culture alive. The audit is complete, the lights have dissolved into memory, but the frequency is eternal. In the final forensics of a cultural empire, the ultimate question isn't how many records were sold or how long the cameras stayed on. The true audit lies in the residual integrity, what remains of the human spirit once the lights, the lawsuits, and the fame have been stripped away. As we close the file on Soul Train, Don Cornelius, and Aretha Franklin, we are not looking at a tragedy of fragmentation, but at a miracle of integration. Despite the cracks, despite the generational wars between soul and hip-hop, and despite the personal shadows of the architect, the frequency they established has become a permanent part of the human atmosphere. The investigation into the post-Cornelius era reveals a fascinating forensic phenomenon. After Don Cornelius's death in 2012, many expected the brand to dissolve into nostalgia. Instead, we witnessed a state of cultural reanimation. The data shows that in the digital age, Soul Train has transitioned from a television show into a sovereign archive. Every viral dance video on TikTok, every choreographed sequence in a global pop tour, and every fashion trend that celebrates Black vintage aesthetic is a direct descendant of the floorboards in that Los Angeles studio. Cornelius may have lost control of the train in his later years, but the investigation concludes that his blueprint of dignity has successfully replicated itself in the DNA of every Black creator who refuses to ask for permission to shine. While the architect found his exit in the shadows, Aretha Franklin's final chapter served as the forensic anchor for the entire culture. The audit of her final decade shows a woman who achieved a state of total sovereignty. She survived the 75% business of the industry and emerged with her 25% of pure, divine talent intact. Her voice remained a high-frequency tool for justice and healing until the very end. The investigation into her global influence reveals that she didn't just sing songs, she provided the acoustic foundation for a people's resilience. She proved that while the train provided the stage, the soul provided the reason for the stage to exist. The forensics of the generational divide also provide a final redemptive data point. The conflict between the polished soul of the 70 seconds and the raw edge of hip-hop the war that so unsettled Don Cornelius has finally reached a state of harmonic convergence. Modern artists like Anderson, Pac, Bruno Mars, and Janelle Monáe have performed a forensic synthesis, blending the elegance of the Soul Train era with the rhythmic defiance of the street. The investigation concludes that the war wasn't a sign of failure, but a sign of growth. The culture had to fragment in order to expand, and in that expansion, it became indestructible. To anyone standing in the shadows of their own story today, this audit offers a profound lesson in survival. The lives of Don Cornelius and Aretha Franklin prove that you do not need to be perfect to be a pioneer. You do not need a flawless history to create a permanent light. The forensic truth is that greatness is often shaped by the very friction that threatens to destroy it. They were architects who built a bridge while the ground beneath them was shaking, and the bridge held because it was rooted in the unfragmented soul of a people who refused to stop moving. The Soul Train line is no longer just a dance. It is a forensic marker of continuity. It is the sound of a people moving forward, carrying their ancestors' elegance and their children's edge into a future that they now own. The investigation is officially closed. The math of the sacrifice has been audited. The result is a legacy that no longer needs a host, a studio, or a contract to survive. It lives in the rhythm, it lives in the burn, and it lives in the sovereign right to be exactly who you are, at full volume. As the final dissolve occurs, we realize that the train didn't just take us to a destination, it taught us how to enjoy the movement. The architect is gone, the queen has taken her seat among the stars, but the track is eternal. If this journey has reminded you of the power of your own voice or the dignity of your own rhythm, then the audit has achieved its purpose. Keep the frequency steady. The legacy is now in your hands.